The Rebel Capitalist Show.
All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to bring someone back to the Rebel Capitalist Show. He is one of my favorite people to speak with. He's also a great buddy of mine and a fellow pro. I guess I'm the amateur, but he's actually the pro, along with Lynn Alden in Rebel Capitalist Pro, the online investment community we have. He needs no introduction to my audience. His name is Chris Macintosh. Chris, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Hey, George. Good to see you, man.
Now, you know what? Usually what I do when I set up these interviews is I won't really prepare or anything. I definitely don't prepare notes. I just make it more conversational. But usually I've got like maybe 3 or 4 questions that I'd kind of like to get to throughout the interview. But today I've only got one question and one question only. And that question, and I get this all the time in my comments of my videos and when I was at Rebel Capitalist Live, this is pretty much all people were talking about. And it's, what should we be prepared for with this whole Klaus World Economic Forum, IMF, global elite narrative? And you know, what do you think the probabilities are of them achieving their objectives, which is basically kind of this Marxist agenda packaged with a nice little bow? And then, but the main question was, okay, we get this is happening, but how do we invest for this? Like, how can we protect our purchasing power? And how can we actually increase our purchasing power if this globalist agenda actually pans out?
It's something that keeps me up at night, George. Look, I guess the starting point is this. We've been here before. Like, if you go back and you look through generational cycles of history, you have all these cycles, right? You have your business cycle, roughly 7 to 10 years. You have a credit cycle, roughly 30 years. You have a sort of 85-year cycle, which then often sort of bumps up against a 100-year credit long-term debt cycle. Mm-hmm. So you kind of have all these cycles, and they just keep kind of going around, and they don't necessarily happen globally. They can just happen in one isolation, in one region, or in one country. Certainly the world that 100 years ago, it was more like that. Europe was much more sort of a centralized type of entity, if you will, and a lot of other, like Africa, because you didn't have trade, you didn't have shipping, the globalization, the sort of connectivity, right, that we have, globalization, right, that we've now experienced post Bretton Woods, didn't exist. So you had these cycles which still took place, but they took place more in isolation, if you will. But they always take place because human nature doesn't change. And so what we have today is the same thing taking place, but this time it's much more of a connected world that we live in. You know, the fact that you and I are business partners, we would never have been doing this even 30, 40 years ago, because the ability for us to actually do it was just so much more difficult.
Right.
And if you go back 100 years ago, certainly it would have been difficult, because we would have had to get on a ship just to get to like a new location where we might meet. And then, you know, it was so the connectivity that has brought the world much closer together means that those cycles or has helped contribute to the fact that those cycles are much more interconnected than they have ever been before.
Does it change the timing of the cycles?
I don't believe so, no. Okay. Well, we don't know for sure, but because look, Bretton Woods and this globalization trend that we've had is really the first part of that cycle that we will know. If we come another 80 years down the track, depending upon what technology exists and whether we have a much more connected or less connected world, we'll be able to try and figure out whether that's true or not. What we can tell, however, is that these cycles, they are both economic, they're social, and they're ideological,
right,
and political. You know, politics is actually just that psychological, social component, which then affects economic and financial. Okay. And when we look at those cycles, it's fairly evident that not the entire world is caught in the same generational cycle or economic cycle. However, unfortunately for us, much of the Western world is within pretty much the same framework, which actually makes sense. If you go back to Bretton Woods, that was essentially a one world currency system, largely. It was the dollar-based system. And everybody that was meshed into that, from an economic standpoint, has had a similar experience post-Bretton Woods. Insofar as globalization has affected them all. You can argue whether it's positive or negative, et cetera, but it's not you cannot argue with the fact that it has affected all of those nations that have been tied into that particular system. So from an economic standpoint, it's not, I don't think it's going to change that cycle. From a political and sort of social aspect, there are very, very stark differences in some places. And you and I have spoken about this before. And so if you look at some of the countries that have experienced their own cycles that are out of sync with the West, for example, if we look at the former Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries, many of those countries experienced these periods of economic stagnation. They experienced communism and so on and so forth, while that wasn't taking place in the West. So so there's a bit of a different cycle, and you'll notice it when you like speak. Like I've got ex-staff that I had a whole team of analysts over in Eastern Europe, and they are all still fairly in touch with East Germany, with what East Germany was, because their parents were alive to live it and to experience it.
Yeah, call it central planning. So this cycle is what you're talking about, where they go from central planning, then more to a decentralized free market system, then back to central planning again.
Yeah, and we've gone towards, like, if you think about what made the West great, was freedom of expression, which gives you freedom of productivity, because you can express yourself, you can think about creating new products. It's all about creativity. It's expanding the pie. Oh, I think this is great. If I designed this particular thing, it would make my life better. And very importantly, within it, there is a component that has to always be there, which is an ability for you to actually get something out of the work that you put in. If you're not going to, which is the problem with communism,
private property rights, right?
You have to have private property rights, and you have to have at least some incentivization scheme for you to actually go out and create something new. You and I might go, oh, well, this is great, we can create that. But if we don't get to keep any of the rewards while we're taking risk in creating that new whatever it is, then it just falls flat on its face. It doesn't make any economic sense or any financial sense or there's no point in taking that risk. So you have to have that component in there. So that was really what began building out of the ashes of World War II, etc. And increasingly that has become socialism. So if you look at government spending as a component of GDP across the Western world, it's just an one-way chart.
Yeah, right.
Okay, and so Karl Marx, bless his cotton socks, was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about one thing, which is that democracy leads to socialism, and socialism ultimately leads to communism. And we're in that later stage of a blow-off top in socialism, and they're trying to implement communism. And
how do you define those, Chris? How are you defining socialism and communism?
Well, socialism allows a certain amount of productivity to remain with the person that's produced the goods.
Okay, so the state controls the means of production, but yet there are still some private property rights. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And then the late stages of that are where the communists decide that they need to take over the ownership and the control of those means of production.
And all the property.
And all property.
Right. Okay.
So this is no secret now why we see at the World Economic Forum, statements like you will own nothing and you will be happy, and you will have no privacy and you're going to be happy. And so on and so forth. So again, we've been here before. We've seen all of this before. It shouldn't actually be any surprise to anybody that's read some amount of economic and historical literature.
Mm-hmm.
So, but back to your question, and it's a very good one. In these times, what you ordinarily have, well, what you always have, is a decline in productivity, potentially a collapse, dependent upon how fast that particular transition takes place. With a decline in the productivity, you also have social upheaval, civil strife, and that in itself brings in political instability. So political instability, social instability. And the faster that it happens, the more unstable it is. It's basically, if you've got the rate of change, if you have the rate of economic change, you see it on the upside and on the downside. So like if you think about crypto billionaires, right? Like the rate of change has been so dramatic that the ability for the human brain to rationally deal with that leads to all sorts of crazy things. I mean, we used to look at Hollywood in order to get the human behavioral element to see what would happen. And it is, obviously, you have people going out and just doing crazy things. It's why drug usage is quite high. People don't have the ability. Suddenly you've got so much money and they don't know what to do with it. And they run around and they do stupid things.
Chris, I had the exact same experience in my own life. Exact same experience. Because I was a self-made millionaire at the age of 34. But I grew up, for the majority of my life, extremely poor. And I wasn't given anything, and all of a sudden you go from being extremely poor to the next, living paycheck to paycheck in your 20s. And the next thing you know, you're 34, you're making millions of dollars, driving around in all these fancy Italian sports cars and doing this and that. And I can tell you right now, it was fun, but I was totally out of control. Out of control. Yeah. And now, if I make that much money, which I have quite a bit in the past, it's much more, you're in total control of the situation.
Because your mind's being able to conceive of what it actually means.
Yeah. But I can tell you from personal experience that's exactly how it works.
Yeah. But the same can happen on the downside. Of course, the downside is not quite as fun.
Yeah, right? you get all the bad side, none of the good side.
and so with that, you get civil unrest, and you get political upheaval, and you get revolutions.
Yeah.
And so we're in a revolutionary cycle. It's that simple. So the question, you'd know this better than anybody. The way that we look at things, we look at them from a top-down view. Okay, we say, okay, what are the major trends that are happening? And where is their value? Where isn't their value? This is a period of trying actually to be as safe as you can possibly be. Where can you put capital where it's not going to be at significant risk? The benefit or the bonus actually is that at these peaks and cycles is that the distortions in the market are so egregious that quite often the places of safety are actually also the cheapest, and the places of insecurity are the most expensive. And that's exactly where we're at today. The things that are valued the highest at this point in the cycle are quote unquote growth stocks, as a broad theme. And if we look at them from any metric, whether it's PE ratios, CAPE ratios, price to sales, price to book, whatever, they're expensive. It's impossible to say they're not. You can argue about how expensive they are, and they could get more expensive, whatever. But to suggest that they're at the lows is patently, evidently false. So we know that much. And again, if you go back through periods of history and cycles, you'll see that often manifests itself that way. So we're in a period now where I think it's most important for people to actually don't even try and focus on how you're going to make the most money. The first step is, how do you not lose a lot of money? And that's not as easy as one would think, because there's and we'll have clients often saying, "Oh, I'm afraid of the market. I'm scared we're going to have a crash. I'm scared of this. I'm scared of that." And so there's often the judgment call to say, "Well, we're going to just step out of the market." And I always put this back on them and I say, "Well, what exactly is stepping out of the market? Because you're always in the market. If you're stepping out of the market, most people say they're actually just going to dollars, right? They're just going into cash. But cash is a position, right? It's a position itself. And so if you, depending on your time frame, we're not traders. We're trying to look out 5-10 years and say we're trying to position for where we need to be. If I said to you, George, here's $1 million. Would you be comfortable just in putting this in cash for the next 5 years? I think most people rationally would look at what's happening at the Federal Reserve and what's happening at the governmental level, and they would say, yeah, maybe that's not the smartest move. I'm not quite sure that my $1 million is going to buy me what I needed to buy me in 5 years' time.
And also, too, that $1 million is most likely going to go into a quote unquote safe money market fund, which goes right into the repo market. And so then they just don't realize they're investing not only in stocks and bonds, but now their safe money's invested in the repo market. This with a rehypothecated treasury.
So you always have to make a decision. There is no I'm out. I'm just stepping out of this. It's a noise. It's a mess. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to step out. You just don't get a choice. It's like if you're on the battleground and there's fucking, good old William Wallace and there's people swinging swords and all, you can't just go, I'm out. Like, this is too messy. I'm just calling time out. You don't get to. You have to make a decision. And so, but back to the trying to answer the question, which is a multifaceted question. From that macro viewpoint, we understand that we're going through this generational cycles we're going through deglobalization now, which is coming at us at warp speed as a consequence of lockdowns.
Right.
And that in itself doesn't just create tensions on a domestic basis. In other words, people losing their jobs or anything else and having difficulties and then trying to deal with those difficulties. It's on an international basis too, because we've created this global system that's so interconnected, right? If we had if what was taking place today took place in the early 1900s, it wouldn't have had anywhere near the ramifications, because global trade was such a tiny percentage of world GDP,
right.
that it would have had an impact. And if we were living in Europe, you might have gone, oh, we didn't get our spices from India, or whatever, but you didn't have the same pressures. Now everything that global supply chain has, the benefit behind it was that everything went to just-in-time inventory. You're like, oh, I need a new cell phone. I'll just jump on Amazon. I'll get one. And all of the components that go into that cell phone come from multiple different jurisdictions. Maybe some of the lithium came from a mine in Guyana. Maybe some of the cobalt came out of the DRC. Maybe some of the aluminium came out of Norilsk project in Russia. All of this shit came together. Maybe it got manufactured in Shenzhen, and then it got shipped, and all of that, and it arrives on your doorstep, and you don't even stop and think about it. All of that is grinding to a halt. So, and
also too, I want to throw one more thing in there, because Friedman, I think, would argue, and I think Thomas Sowell would argue the same thing, that it also allows countries to produce what they produce most efficiently. And because in Russia, as an example, might produce XYZ more efficiently than the United States, and the United States may produce ABC more efficiently. So instead of them having to both produce XYZ and ABC, the one can focus on what they do best, the other can focus on what they do best, and then just trade back and forth. The problem with that, to what your point is if those countries stop doing business with one another, now they're left with what they can only produce. And in the United States, we really can't produce much of anything.
It's the benefit to trade is massive. It's outsourcing. You can't. What's that old saying? You can't be jack of all trades and master of none. That world left. Like we didn't need to do that anymore, right? You can focus on what you're very good at, let your neighbor focus on what he's very good at, and then trade with him, and you're all going to come away with a better outcome. So, like we're on this kind of mini farm, and like I'm not a farmer's backside, right? But fortunately, we've got neighbors who are quite good at what they're doing, and so I seek their help often in terms of just, what should we do here and there and that. But really, I can outsource a lot of that, right? I can hire somebody in to come and do some fencing for me if I haven't got time, or to come and, drench cattle and things that I don't really want to do it, and B, I don't actually have the skills. I can probably do it, but I might break my arm, and so I can outsource all of that. Now, when I can no longer outsource that, or when the costs to actually doing that become prohibitive, there's just less supply of everything. I maybe don't have as much cattle as I would have otherwise had, because now I've got to do it, and I'm not that skilled or that productive. So productivity just declines. And we'll also see when international relations like that take place, often there's conflict, right? It's what's that old saying, when goods don't move, bullets do. And that's evidently true. So we're going through this period not only on a domestic basis, which is a lot of turmoil, but on an international basis. So the question then comes down to, you need to have countries that will have the ability to ideologically stay on some path that is not classed, if you will,
or Marxist or central planning Marxist. Yeah.
And there's no obvious look. You and I are libertarians, and most of our friends are in that sort of realm. But the reality is that when you go through these periods of time, libertarianism is largely a waste of time. And I say it's largely, and that's coming from somebody who would dearly love to see that on scale. But what libertarians are, they're like cats, right? They're impossible to herd because we're all self-driven, self-minded, and we don't like collectivism, right? We don't want to be told what to do. We want to do what we want to do, and be left alone to do that. But when you have a force coming at you, you have to have some level of collectivism in order to actually repel that force. If you go back and you think about a guy like Churchill was an absolute authoritarian, but he was exactly what Britain needed at the time. Okay. And without him, who knows what the world would look like. So we're going through this period where you're going to have new alliances are formed. And what we can count on is self-interest will always fundamentally, ultimately dictate.
When you talk about alliances, Chris, I just want to be clear there. You're talking about alliances between governments and countries, correct?
But yes. And so when you look at countries, it's important to look at their economic structure, their ideological structure, and also where they're at with respect to these cycles in terms of ideologies and so on and so forth, which is why I mentioned, Eastern Europe and places like that. So if you look at the world like that, and then you look at Klaus's world, where he wants to just implement this massive new world order across global governments, you can see that, again, self-interest is going to bump up against that, because there is an impossibility that all of the facets that Klaus and his Davos crowd want to implement across social, economic, political, all the way down to what food we eat, to implement each and every one of those and have all of these parties around the world be in line with that and have their self-interests mesh with that, it's impossible.
Yeah, the self-interest of the countries, not just the individuals in the countries. So as an example, one of their big pushes is climate. I don't know what the heck they call it something different every day, but I guess it's climate change or climate crisis or whatever they're calling it right now. And that I'm not here to say that that's good, bad, or the other, but I am here to say that I think the reason they're pushing it has nothing to do with altruism or clean air. I think the reason they're pushing it is because it has to do with being able to control people and to control countries. But what you're saying is, if this is one of their main priorities, you look at the countries who economically would not benefit or economically could be destroyed as a result of this movement, let's say, and then you come to the conclusion that they most likely won't play ball with the global elite, and therefore they will want no part of this little network that they're creating of this Marxist vision.
Absolutely. It's that, and if you look at that, well, firstly, you talk about the climate change or whatever you want to call it, renewable, build back better, green initiative, and everything else. And we've proven this. That's actually patently false, because the amount of the components that are required to build that world are typically far more environmentally destructive than the world that we have today. And Michael Schellenberger has just actually came out with a really fantastic article. I think it's in the Wall Street Journal. I'm not sure, where he details solar and how economically destructive solar power is, and environmentally destructive it is, like 10 times worse than coal, basically. But you can bring this sort of evidence to the table, and an ideology is like a cult. It doesn't care. So it doesn't. Facts no longer matter. We're living in a world where facts no longer matter, and the only thing that matters is the cult and the ideology. So that's the force that's coming. Now, so what you look for is this self-interest component behind it. And so there's certain countries, as you correctly mentioned, that A, economically, P, politically, C, ideologically, don't benefit from jumping on that particular bandwagon. And so what you will see is that those who are captured, if you will, under that, will increasingly have rhetoric towards these countries that aren't going to follow that path, which is, it's no surprise to us that Russia is increasingly in the spotlight, as the Russians did this and the Russians did that.
Yeah, the public enemy number one.
Public enemy number one for multiple reasons. One is that they are two things: their energy and their agriculture. And so these are the two things that are on the hit list of the World Economic Forum and the Davos crowd, because energy, they believe, is just killing the planet. So we need to get rid of fossil fuel energy, and we need to use this new renewables side of things. And B, the other one is food. And they believe food production is highly carbon emitting and bad for humanity and whatever the case might be. And they want us to all eat bugs. I know this sounds insane, but that's literally what they're talking about. So the other component, of course, is just control and money, because you can't patent nature, which is why they don't want to have raw natural seeds. They want to have everything GMO. And in meat production, they can't control that. It's been a very, very difficult, like if you look at Monsanto, they've never been able to actually infiltrate into the meat processing business at all, not to any real extent. They've done it very, very efficiently in seed production, which is not a good thing for us, but it's there nevertheless. But they've struggled on the meat side. So they're now pushing meat as a bad thing, and they want to create their own synthetic meat, because that can all be patented, and that's just a never-ending revenue stream. If you've got the patents on that, you own it. And of course, they can put any chemicals they want into it.
What do you think their angle is with pushing the whole woke agenda? And they meaning the Davos crowd, the World Economic Forum. I mean, they really push that almost as much as they push the things that we typically hear about, whether it's the not eating meat or the the climate change or the fourth industrial revolution or AI, but they also really, really, really push that woke agenda. Well, what do you think the rationale behind that is?
Well, I'm not sure 100% on that. I mean, we tend to focus a lot on the economic side of things, which is more quantifiable. But I have some thoughts, and my thoughts are basically, if you go back and you look at the Marxist thinking.
Yeah, there you go. That's what I think too.
It's Marx and Brett Weinstein, who's the evolutionary biologist, who he had, when was it, back in the
both he and his brother are fantastic. Eric Weinstein's incredible too. Yeah.
If you guys haven't followed them, follow them on Twitter, and on
for sure.
Brett's got the Dark Horse podcast, which is amazing. But what they talked about was the universities have been infiltrated by this Marxist thinking.
Right.
And that was taking place back in the 90s. And that was back in the 90s when they said, look, we've got a problem here. And then, sort of 2000, I think the Evergreen fiasco.
Chris, one thing I wanted to add there, I just looked up my Tom Woods podcast feed, and because he just did an episode on this, that thing that you're talking about, going back, this woke agenda that goes back to Marxism, a lot of it is based in something called critical race theory, and that goes back to the way it all goes back to gaining power, and that's the way the Marxists use that. Lenin used that, and then we're seeing it being used today. And I would also add that if you look at the way they're attacking, I mean, you mentioned the schools. And one thing that I've pointed out through studying history is that we'll keep it YouTube friendly. So the Germans prior to World War II, and you know the group I'm talking about, they had kind of a three-pronged approach. And number one, they would try to eliminate critical thinking in lieu of emotions. They would try to, they would say, okay, guys, forget the critical thinking. That really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's all about how you feel. And then they would try to infiltrate the schools by creating cheap radios. And they did this in the households as well. And of course, they set up a boogeyman, and we all know who that was. But if you see what the global elite are doing now, it's, I'm not saying they're part of the same group that will go unmentioned, but what I am saying is they're using the exact same tactics, because you can see everything. Yeah. It's now about how you feel. There's no critical thinking.
Same thing. I spent some time last year we were traveling through Europe, and I spent quite a lot of time just researching Yugoslavia and what took place there, how that entire place blew up, what were the dynamics, what were the particular tools, if you were, that were utilized by the various factioning parties, and how did that all transpire. And I kid you not, George, it is textbook. It's the same thing. When you study that, and then you look at what's taking place today, you realize how criminal it is that we don't teach our children this sort of history.
Yep.
So yes, it's textbook stuff, but what it does, look, everything comes down to collectivism.
Right.
If you can, because who is the collective? Like, who speaks for the collective? There's always one party. It's just centralization, one party at the top. So you have your opinion, I have my opinion. We're just decentralized. But if I say, no, well, we have to have the same opinion, and I force you to have my opinion in some shape or form, right? And I say, no, it's for the good of humanity. Well, who's speaking for humanity? Who's speaking for the us? There's always some party that decides who that is.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime you hear a politician saying it's for the good of society,
or the greater good,
for the greater good, you know what you're looking at. It is not at all what they're suggesting. Everybody must wear a mask for the greater good. Everybody must take a vaccine for the greater good.
Right.
Which on a factual basis, you can see is patently, evidently false, because if you are at risk and you're wanting to take a vaccine, go and take your vaccine, right? And then you should be protected. You don't need me to take a vaccine in order for you to be protected, because if that is the case, then clearly the vaccine doesn't work.
Right.
So, but those are these, these are evident facts that any rational person could look at and say, well, that makes sense. And yet we're in a situation where the vast majority of the populace discount it because of emotion.
Right.
Right. And so you're told that you need to do your part for society. And I'm just using the vaccines because that's a current narrative and something that's being pushed and utilized at this point in time. But it can be anything. It's climate change. Oh, well, you're driving a gas guzzling diesel engine or whatever it is. You're not doing your part for humanity. And so you say, well, who's to choose humanity? It's that person at the top who says that you shouldn't be doing it. So you get this collectivism, and they use these multiple different pillars to bring to manipulate society into falling under whatever it is that they're trying to do. So
and to disseminate the propaganda in a way that's easy for people to digest and sounds fantastic. It sounds great. Yeah.
Like who wouldn't want to have a cleaner planet?
Right. Right.
Who wouldn't want to have a healthier society? You want people to die? What are you like? So, and if you try and bring up the rational argument of that it's not required that you should take some experimental vaccine in order for society to be safe, everybody else can do it and let everybody choose. That even though on a factual evidence-based thinking that's rational, it gets washed over by that emotional overreach, if you will. So that's being utilized at scale across the world. The question, when we look at this, with a big one around the climate narrative, is that if you look at countries in the world and the ideologies of those countries, it's very evident to us that some are going to fall into that and some are not. We take Canada as an example. Canada is very similar to Russia. It is energy and it is food.
Yeah, but they've gone off the deep end.
There's no ways I'm putting a cent of my capital into Canada, right? Because they're going completely the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I contrast that to a place like Russia, Russia has no interest in getting rid of their fossil fuels. They have no interest in trying to decimate their agricultural production. That's the lifeblood of their economy. That's the lifeblood of their people. And so you have a massive divergence there. That's a good thing insofar as it creates more asymmetry, because while you're getting productivity declines, which we will get in Canada and many other parts of the world, and just across supply chains which have been impacted, we're going to have, it's not enough to say, okay, I want to be in agriculture, and you just go out and buy an agricultural ETF that might have a whole lot of equities that are based in Canada, because that's not going to help you. Yes, you got the sector right, but you're in the wrong jurisdiction, buddy, right? And so the world is bifurcating as we speak into these pockets. And what you'll start seeing, and I write about a lot, is these new alliances that will be formed. Because just as like no man is an island and you can't function on your own, you retrench in a period of deglobalization. We're getting this retrenchment. People going back to their roots, going back to their core, and that's tribalism. It's going back to your ideologies, whatever those might be. They could be religious, political, you name it. And so that's that contraction back to the core, back to a level of trust. It's all about trust. What we're seeing in the Western world is a complete destruction of all of the pillars of trust that we have established for the last 50, 100 years. You think about the legal system.
And that's cyclical too, Chris. I mean, if you look at the fourth turning, that's cyclical as well.
100%. And so we're still in that phase where it's being destroyed and people are clinging to it. They're clinging to the hope that the judicial system will sort out some of this insanity. Oh, well, we can sue it. We can bring about change in the judicial system, right? But increasingly, you're seeing that that's not happening, or it's not happening to the extent that it should. And so the system's not working. And so you can't trust the system. And then you've got, say, the healthcare system. And you say, can we trust this healthcare system? They're telling us all of these things, and then they're changing their mind. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. Wear 3 masks. Social distance, don't hug your friends. Do hug your friends. Like, it's just flip. So you're just seeing a destruction in the trust. And we haven't even got to the Federal Reserve. So all of these, whether they're social, political, economic, all of these pillars that have built up and created what has been the most wealthy society in the world are being destroyed as we speak. So what people do is you say, what can you go to that you can trust? That's quite simple. If you think about it from an asset allocation perspective, what can you trust? I mean, obviously gold is one thing that you can look at and say, well, it's still gold. It's going to be there. It's, I don't have to worry about a CEO that's doing something funny, or I don't have to worry about too many things. It is what it is if you're buying just the physical metal. But the same is true across pretty, much of the commodity spectrum. So in a period of distrust, in a period of collapsing trust, the idea that you would put money into quote unquote growth assets, to me, is fairly absurd, especially when they're at all-time highs.
But I think one of the main, I'm sorry to cut you off, Chris, but I think one of the main takeaways here for everyone listening is that you've got to start thinking about jurisdictional risk, not just, okay, I'm bullish on ag, so what ETF do I buy? I'm bullish on farmland. I'm bullish on oil. I'm bullish on uranium. I'm bullish on copper. I'm bullish on nickel, or whatever. You got to start there. Okay, that's fine. But then, usually you could just make that decision and then analyze, kind of do a bottoms up type analysis with the individual producers and come to some good conclusions. But what you're saying is you've got to still do all that stuff, but then you've got to take it another step and say, where is this gold mine actually located? Where is this, what's the jurisdictional risk that I'll have with the political narrative in country XYZ, and how they're going to fit into this grand scheme of things with the World Economic Forum, or be or they're going to be a part of another group that might not want anything to do with that type of collective narrative, in which case I would assume you would say that capital may be treated much better there, and therefore you'd want to favor those types of jurisdictions.
Correct. And the other thing that right now, the difference between, shall we call it the West, assets in the West and assets outside of the West, there's still a divergence there. If I just look at oilers, your Russian oil companies trade at much, much lower valuations than your Western counterparts. And on the Western counterpart side, we've got two things taking place. One, on the political level, they're impacting it, whether it be higher taxes, carbon taxes, or just outright banning of particular infrastructure projects, et cetera. That's obviously negative towards that industry. But on top of that, your many of the stakeholders in those companies are forcing them to actually move away from their production into things like wind and solar and algae and all sorts of crazy stuff, right? So that's, again, more productivity declines that you're going to see out of that. And sometimes it's like the CEOs don't necessarily want that, but like we saw just recently with Shell. So Shell's one of their largest shareholders is BlackRock, and BlackRock are super woke and just pushing this. So they've forced them to start cutting back production.
Right.
They're doing no more new drilling, no more exploration. So like that's just a dying entity. If you're trying to be long oil and you're going long Shell, to me, you're not getting what you're trying to get out of it. Now,
right. But there's two sides of the coin, which I think is where you're going with this. And most people look at the demand side. Well, then they say, okay, Chris, well, what you're saying is that I should never, ever, ever invest in oil because the demand side is just going to continue to go down because of this whole ESG movement, but they're not looking at the supply side. And I think that's where you're going next.
So the first thing is 2012 was pretty much the last peak in terms of the broad commodity spectrum. Okay. Any commodity cycle, you have way too much production comes on board when prices are rising, because you can access capital, whether it be equity or debt financing. You can access it easily. If you're a mining CEO, you're not really worrying. You're going to make money as long as you can. Okay. And the other component behind commodity spectrum is it's got a pretty long lead time. If you want to go and get a mine into production from woe to go, you're looking at 7 to 10 years anyway, which is typically why you have these commodity cycles lasting that period of time. Prices ramp up, production comes back online, and well, people begin to try and bring production back online. But again, you've got a lead time there. So prices just keep rising. And then more capital goes, oh, I also want a piece of this. Oh, he has a new exploration project. Yeah, I'll throw some money at that. And they're going to look for some, gold in the boondocks and wherever. And so the money pours in. Now, 7 to 10 years later, it all comes on stream. Suddenly, there's just tons of production just pouring
Shale
out.
is a good example.
Collapse.
The shale
Shale's
oil.
a perfect example.
Yeah.
So coming back, our last peak was 2010, 2012, somewhere there. Okay. Since that, we've had the opposite, right? Because prices collapse. Nobody's going to run out and try and start drilling for oil or anything else when prices are collapsing. Why would you? It's insane. So shareholders don't want to put money into it. Your previous debt holders, they all got wiped out in the last cycle high. They've all become equity holders of these newly restructured companies. And they both, most of the time, they just flog it because they get so pissed off. They just, and so you have this big washout. And so a lot of the entities in the place in that space get washed out, et cetera, et cetera. Now, coming back through to pretty much about 2016, 2017 was when we should have been at the lows. And you should have had, just if you look at supply and demand, we should have had companies going out and looking to replace reserves. But we didn't. And we didn't because of this ESG movement and this woke capitalism, if you will, which has said, no, we're not going to need coal, we're not going to need oil or natural gas or any of this stuff. We're going to go down this path over here. And so they started diverting capital that way, which means that your reserves have collapsed. It means that what should have been taking place for the last 3-4 years has not been taking place. That creates more asymmetry because when the prices are rising, ordinarily now you would have capital coming in looking to take advantage of that. But we have this enormous political pressure that's saying no capital in. If you put capital in, we're going to penalize you. Okay, so this cycle is going to be one for the record books, in our humble opinion, because what should be taking place in a normal capitalist market is not taking place. Now, while that's all happening, this is not a global. It's not the same thing globally. This is mostly a Western phenomenon. If you look at China, I'll use China as a good example because they basically have gotten a free pass from the UN and the IMF and all these for whatever reason. They've come out and they've said, yes, we're going to go down the carbon zero path by 2060. Everyone else is going to do it by 2030 or somewhere, along those lines. But if you look at what they're saying and what they're doing, they're complete diametrically opposite. So China, for example, is building 130 coal-fired power stations right now. They are building the world's biggest refinery right now.
It was coal.
No, oil refinery.
Oil, okay, got it.
But in coal, they've got, so domestically, they are pouring money into the energy space. They're doing a little bit of solar and a little bit of that, but literally it's lip service. Now, if you want to put your tinfoil hat on or your geopolitical hat on, how would you become the world's strongest power energy has always been the dominant theme. There's no country that's ever won a war that's not been energy independent or had. So what you got in the West is they're destroying the energy independence. And in the East, they're actually sucking it all up. They're just soaking it all up. The assets that are being sold off by these Western majors, guess who's buying them? Because nobody in the West has got the spine to go out there and actually bid on and buy these assets. If you and I trawled around the US, if we did a little, hey,
a road show,
let's do a Chris George oil company, and we're going to buy up all these cheap assets, and we went to go and raise capital, and we went to all the institutions, we'd be kicked out of the door,
right?
Because they're being pressured from multiple sources where you can't put money into the space. If we wanted to go and do a green something, we'd raise tons of money. I've got a buddy.
Especially if it was a SPAC. We need to raise a green SPAC, Chris.
Yeah. I got a buddy who just went out and he raised $100 million for a green bullshit ETF. It's not an ETF, it's a fund. And he's open about it. I mean, I disagree with it, but basically I said, this stuff is garbage. He goes, yeah, no, but I can raise $100 million and I can charge 1 basis point on it and it's like nothing. It's like, it's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't I? So he's going to make a few $1 million a year just by tapping into that virtue signaling thing. So anyway, the point is you can't get capital into the West in this space. More productivity declines, creates more asymmetry in the stuff that's out there. But importantly, and I'll finish in a second, what you're seeing is the political power and shift that has taken place over the last 18, 22 months is, I couldn't have written this as a story 5 years ago. And you having believed me. And like, you would have called the men in white coats. I would have called them men in white coats. Like, it's literally insane, but it's happening. And so within that, what we're watching is those alliances that are forming. And it's Russia in the Middle East. It's China. It's even Turkey. Turkey, you'll notice, for example, had never signed the Paris Climate Accord. They've always, they were playing that game. They're part of NATO. They're not part of the EU. They'll never be, by the way, they're never going to become part of the EU, in my opinion. But there, again, you've got an ideology that Erdogan's a nutter. Look, all of these people are sociopaths. Don't ever think they're your friends. They're not. But as investors, what we're doing is we're looking and we have to play them off against one another.
Right.
And so, and people have said to me before, you're going to be buying Russian, why are you buying Russian oil companies? Or, look, I'm fully aware that corporate governance in Russia is not amazing. Everything becomes relative. So, however, if I'm buying them at super cheap, very, very cheap valuations, we know that they're not woke. They have zero intention of declining productivity or anything like that. And then on the other side of things, if I'm going down the BP, the Shells, they're getting rid of those assets. They're selling them off and going into wind and solar and all sorts of other things. It just becomes a no-brainer trade. And so capital is already shifting. You're going to see these capital flows taking place. And you're going to try and get ahead of it. But again, the jurisdictional side of things is something that most Western investors have never dealt with this before. And you have to get your head around it, because if you don't, you might be in the right sector, but you're going to still get whitewashed because it's like saying Venezuela's great. They got a lot of oil. They've got the second largest oil reserve in the world. Let's go long Venezuela.
I've got 3 takeaways here. I try to write them down on my phone here as we were going, because I don't have my legal pad. But number 1, you've got that. I think investors need to think about that jurisdictional risk we're talking about. Number 2, they need to really pay attention to the narrative, not just within the country, but within the corporation itself. Because you gave the example of Shell Oil. Now, you may be someone who's wildly bullish on oil, but you're not going to touch Shell with a 10-foot pole because they're trying to divest themselves of all of the things that are making them money right now. They're trying to get rid of all the oil assets they have and buy wind and solar. So you've got to pay even more attention to the business itself. And if they're drinking the Klaus Kool-Aid, let's say, then you've got the jurisdictional risk. That's two things right there that investors need to pay more attention to than they probably are right now. You can't just go out and buy a random ETF because you're bullish gold, or excuse me, bullish oil. Number three is usually the cure for high prices are high prices. Because what happens, that price gets up, the higher the price goes, it attracts more investment, which creates more supply, which brings the price back down to some sort of equilibrium point when it gets in, when it equals up with the demand side of the equation. But now what you're saying is, especially with oil, because there's not going to be any capital going into oil because of this ESG movement, or a lot less, that we could be heading into a super cycle where the cure for high prices are not high prices, that the high prices just continue to go up because we're not allowing, or the governments are not allowing the cure, which would be more capital investment, to take place, and they're not allowing more supply to hit the market. So even if demand does decrease because people are favoring Teslas, let's say, it's still not going to overpower the supply decrease because of the lack of capital investment that we've had over the last 3 years and that we will have into the future. I think those are like kind of the three main takeaways from the last 10 minutes. Am I correct there, Chris?
Yeah, there's one thing I'd just like to add to it. So if you think about the USSR, they had massive productivity declines. You had higher prices, but it didn't bring on more supply. Why? Because there was no incentive. There's no meritocracy. There wasn't the ability for any individual to profit from or have their life become better by taking the actions to bring about that additional supply.
Right.
And so there was no more supply.
No animal spirits. No animal spirits.
Yep. So we're seeing that component. Now, what happens is, I think there's a very good test case here, which is Germany. In 2014, Germany decided they're going down this renewables path. That's when they began. So they've gotten rid of their coal, they've gotten rid of their solar, their nuclear. By the way, they have a whole lot of lignite, which is fucking awful stuff. But the largely what's taken place is their cost of electricity is ramped up, and they have now the highest cost of electricity in all of Europe. Their carbon emissions have not gone down, by the way, but facts don't matter in an ideology. And they have now taken what was energy security and they've made it energy insecurity. So they are now under the thumb of Putin, which is the natural gas. Their other component of energy that they get is from France, which is nuclear. And the French and the Germans haven't always been friends. And the other one is Poland, which is coal. And so they've lost they've lost energy security. And with energy security, as I've always said, you have political security. So while you're getting this divergence in the world, those countries that are controlling that energy supply they will exert more and more influence over the others. It's going to happen. It's China is going to become much, much more aggressive, militarily wise, economically wise, because they're going to have the ability to do that. If you look at the One Belt, One Road initiative, which I'm writing about in the weekly, that whole componentry is all around infrastructure and energy and trade lanes.
Right.
And those people who control the trade lanes ultimately typically have the world reserve currency. Because you've got to pay seigniorage to use the trade lanes. Yeah. And so they can dictate what that gets paid in. They're not going to get paid in dollars.
And you think that's where the digital yuan comes into play?
I think so.
Yeah.
So One Belt, One Road is an initiative towards their currency becoming the world's reserve currency.
Right.
So, and they're trying to do that on a technological front, right? Which is Huawei and 5G and satellites. And they're trying to do it on the trade routes, which is all of the ports that they now own and control. And the belt or the road, should we say, the old road. So in that respect, you've got the old Silk Road. And if you look, it's Middle East, it's through the Stans, it's Turkey, and they've got railroads and everything.
Goes into Africa as well.
Yeah. So all of that, they're building, and none of that happens without fossil fuels, none of it. And they're spending and investing heavily in the ability for them to bring that to fruition, because they're going to own those routes and they're going to have seigniorage on who pays to use them, which will give them that domination in world reserve currency. We're not there yet, but that's what's being developed. Now, you'd look at that and go, well, maybe they're going to get there in 30, 40 years' time. I would say that would be true if it weren't for the fact that the West is literally stepping off a cliff. I mean, so you got one side that's just doing this crazy, they're doing everything they can possibly do to commit suicide, economically, politically, financially, socially. All that China really actually needs to do is just stand still, unfortunately. So as that's all taking place, again, you come back to the investments, it's important to actually look at the jurisdiction of their assets. And I'm not saying don't go and buy a company that's listed on the TSX. You got to look at where's the company's head offices. They might be in Montreal or in Toronto or something. That's not necessarily a problem, provided that their assets are outside. If their assets are in Guyana, or if they're in Azerbaijan or something like that, if there's pressures that come from the state government to say, you shouldn't be doing gold mining or oil refining or whatever the particular business is, what'll happen is the same thing that happened in South Africa, my original home, which is that they'll say, okay, we're out of here. And they'll simply sell those assets to a new corporate entity that happens to then get listed in Shanghai or Hong Kong or Moscow or Warsaw, and the capital shifts. That's how you get capital flows. NASDAQ came out with, you can't have a listing unless you have, is it a black member on your board and a woman, and like this
or woke,
critical race theory
woke nonsense
kind of stuff,
right,
pushing into NASDAQ. So
right,
what happens? Well, now if you want to list on NASDAQ, yes, you want the capital, it's got big capital markets, but this is now the element which makes it less attractive. So we're going to just see this shift, because ultimately people will go, the hell with that, I'm just going to go and list in Shanghai.
Right.
Capital shift. So how do you get to a digital yuan? That's the world reserve currency. This is how. This is how.
So what do you think of Brazil, and what do you think of the rest of Asia? So we didn't talk about Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, that whole area.
Yeah, look, I think that's already captured. They're going to fall under the dominance of China, unquestionably. If you look at just trade, the level of trade between various countries, that gives you an indication as to where their economic servitude might lie, essentially. And so certainly Southeast Asia and all of that it's also a trend, right? So if you go back 20 years ago, much of that trade was off to the United States and to other parts of the Western world where they're selling their goods. And that has been shifting and changing. So I think that trend is fairly evident and fairly clear. So I think those countries are going to basically fall under the dominance of China. And when it comes to Brazil,
but you don't think they're gonna buy into this whole World Economic Forum agenda?
They will buy into what China tells them to buy into ultimately.
Okay.
And so no, I don't, because China, for example, like we just took Indonesia. So Indonesia is one of the major producers of coal that gets fed into the Chinese engine, if you will.
Okay.
And also to India, by the way. And so they're not, there's no indications that they're going to change from that policy.
Okay.
There is one country within that region that's changing a bit, which is Japan. Japan's kind of somewhat more Western, and they're putting in a lot more policies and ESG sort of stuff and that. That are sort of a bit of an anomaly within that entire region, which is interesting because Japan's also one of the countries that has always had to try and focus on their energy security because they don't have any energy. They've always had to import their energy, which is actually why they started using nuclear in one of the first places. But if you look at that, we talked about sort of generational cycles. Japan's in a similar generational cycle to the rest of the West, whereas much of Southeast Asia is not. So I think that could explain some of the ideological moves that are taking place in Japan, which are different, very different to China and very different to broader Southeast Asian region.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned Brazil. I'm cautiously optimistic on Brazil. It's politically, it's quite unstable. I don't think Bolsonaro is going to stay. And if Lula gets in, then I'll be less bullish. Because he's a Marxist, really. So Brazil, a lot of these countries have got all the resources, they've got everything that you could want, but that's not enough. You need to have a desire, and you also need to have the military and economic ability to actually bring that to fruition. So in other words, like people have said to me, oh, what about, and they talk about small little countries. If you're a small little country, you're always going to be under the thumb of some larger country and their military prowess. And so that's just a geopolitical reality, which is why if you're looking in, say, Europe, like a place like Montenegro, it doesn't really matter. They're just a tiny little country. They're just going to fall under one or another particular sort of hegemony. Right. So Brazil kind of is in a similar light, but I have noticed, for example, the EU they were trying to, what did they come out with? They wanted to sanction them or tax them on meat production because they said that they've got too much meat production. And that's cows farting and carbon emissions and all this crazy stuff. They pushed back and basically told them to go and get stuffed. But the fact that they're pushing that, obviously that's a worry.
You're right. Because it starts with pushing, but then it just comes more and more and more and more and more until it comes to fruition.
And this is where we're headed towards. If this woke agenda, look, they're gonna do it at an international level, where they're going to turn around and tell emerging market countries that they can't use fossil fuels, or they're going to be taxed on the use of fossil fuels, or they shouldn't be producing meat. Now, for much of the Western developed world, that might not be as catastrophic a situation, but for emerging markets where they're living hand to mouth,
you're done.
The difference between
you're done.
It's life and death.
You're done. Yeah, and if anyone disagrees with that, I would challenge you to go to Ecuador for a month, or go to Colombia, go to a rural part of Colombia for a month, or the outskirts of Medellin or Bogota. You'll understand real quickly why it's completely unrealistic for a country like that to just go solar really quick or stop eating meat or something. That's not going to happen.
Well, if it does happen, what it means is mass starvation. And,
right.
And you can't have mass starvation without civil unrest and revolutions.
Yeah, right.
So you kind of get into the space where you're going to have potentially international conflict. So when we look at the world, we look at these regions, which, look, much of Africa doesn't have the military might and economic might to necessarily go, screw you, we're not doing that. They probably will, but you need to have sufficient force. If I look around the world and look at the projection of force, it's basically China, Russia, and economically, it's the Middle East. They've got a lot of money and they've got the resources, but they don't have a military capabilities, which is why they're going to they've always hooked their horse to some particular military regime that's benefited them. Right. In the past, it's been the United States, and increasingly, it's not going to be that. It's going to be Russia and China. And we're seeing those military alliances already being put into place. Mm. So that's the new bloc. And they will have the ability to actually push back and say, no, we're not going to do this. No, we're not going to do that. And so you move into like a bipolar type of world. Yeah, so that's kind of how we're looking at it.
Yeah, that's how you're looking at kind of the global macro and how you are allocating capital. And you're someone that has allocated capital professionally for the last at least 2 or 3 decades, at least 2 decades. And so that's kind of your top-down approach. Number one, you look at these countries that don't want to play ball with the World Economic Forum's narrative. You're looking at the jurisdictions, then you're looking at the individual countries and kind of, how they're playing the game. And then you're trying to base your probabilities on which countries are going to set up these networks with one another that are going to be friendly to capital. And that's where you're trying to do more and more homework to try to find those individual companies that are quote unquote cheap and you think have good risk reward.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, buddy. I know I've kept you a little too long, but that was a fascinating conversation, as it always is. I just want to remind everyone that Chris is one of the pros in Rebel Capitalist Pro. So if you want to check that out, we'll put a link, I guess, in the description below. I think Gene normally has like a $1 trial offer for a week, something like that. Gene is my digital marketing guy. But for those of you who want to find out more about Chris directly, Chris, where can they go? I know you're trying to not use Twitter and Facebook and social media. So is there anywhere where they can reach you?
Yeah, just the website, capitalistexploits.at or .com will get you there as well. So it's just capitalist exploits, one word.
Okay. Very cool, man. Well, I appreciate your time, and I sure hope we can get you at the next Rebel Capitalist Live. Everyone was asking about you there, and hopefully we can get you out of the jail cell you're in New Zealand and get you into a place where you got a little bit more freedom and liberty, and we can get you in front of a group of people sharing your infinite wisdom.
I don't know about infinite wisdom, but I got thoughts. That's always good.
All right, buddy. Take it easy. We'll talk to you soon.